Hi, Nicole. Welcome to the Smash Your Own Ceiling podcast. I'm so pleased that you're here.
Thank you so much for inviting me on the show.
No, it's going to be such a good conversation because we're going to be talking all about difficult conversations today, which is something that I know so many of my audience really struggle with. So I can't wait to delve into this with you. So before we start properly, how about you introduce yourself? And because you'll probably do a much better job than if I did it.
Okay, so I am a leadership, communication and conflict coach, basically. And I work with leaders and small business owners to communicate more effectively so they don't actually have the need for the difficult conversations. And then if they do, I'm there to support them on their journey.
Yeah, I love that. It's such a needed area. So how did you get into this? I'm curious.
I'll give you the brief version, as brief as I can. Years and years and years ago, I used to work in PR, and it was all about learning how to communicate well, and it was a very toxic workplace, long hours, very, very glamorous industry, very toxic. The kind of things that happened in that industry would probably never be tolerated today. I got married at that time, and my husband said to me, I never see you. You work evenings, weekends. If this marriage is going to work, you have to choose between the job. Anyway, I chose. I left the job, not him. And that came later. And basically, I set up my own communication writing for marketing purposes, copywriting. Fast forward about 20 years. And I had then by then got divorced, had my 3 lovely boys, and I wanted to do something a little bit more stimulating. So I joined just a psychology study group, a weekly group, just for my own interest, and learned way too much about myself in that time. And when that came to an end after about 6 years, I thought, you know what, I want to do something with this. I don't want to go back into full-time education. What can I do? So I did a distant learning counselling course, and one of the modules on that was mediation. And I thought, this is interesting, because unlike a lot of other therapies or counselling, there was a defined timeline to it. So you knew you had a day to do mediation and sort out people's problems, relationship problems. So I thought, this is up my street. So I decided to train to be a mediator. And the course was taught from the psychology of conflict, which for me was brilliant because I'd just done my psychology and it sort of married it all together nicely. And I then decided to specialize in workplace mediation because I remembered the really toxic nature of my previous world, PR world. And I just thought, you know what, I wish there was a mediator in those days. There probably was, but didn't know about it. And learned, how to deal with these difficult situations, how to negotiate, how to navigate them more effectively. So specialized in workplace mediation. And as a result of the mediations that I was doing, I realized that a lot of these difficult conversations were happening, or the need for the mediations were happening, because at leadership level, the head of departments or managers didn't know how to address problems when they came up. They didn't know how to have difficult conversations. They avoided them, they were scared of them, they didn't have time for them. And I thought, well, actually, they're probably the ones that need more help. So I decided, okay, I'm going to learn to be a coach. I was actually already doing it a bit without realizing. So I trained to be an executive conflict coach. And from there, started training leaders and business owners how to have difficult conversations. So that's the brief version of the story.
Amazing. Oh, I love that. I love that. One thing that really struck me, first of all, how the toxic environment of your previous job actually served you in the end, didn't it? So
absolutely, yeah.
Isn't it strange when that happens?
Out of bad comes good. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the first thing that struck me. But also, Nicole, that I want to dive into, because something that really interests me actually is you mentioned that a lot of leaders actually avoid and resist, and they might not have time for, but ultimately they're avoiding the difficult conversation. Why do you think that is?
There are quite a few reasons. A lot of them don't have the skills. Mm, in my experience, a lot of managers were doing a brilliant job before, promoted into a managerial role, which is a different job.
Yes.
It's completely different. And if the organization doesn't invest in training, these poor managers are kind of like thrown into the lion's den to get on with it. And let's be honest, it is managing people is difficult. It's a difficult job. So that's the first thing. They don't have the training or the skill set. Then a lot of them are scared of confrontation. There's a lot of fear behind it. They're afraid of confrontation themselves. They are scared of mismanaging the conversation. Perhaps in the past they haven't managed them well, so they just assume that they're always going to go badly. They're scared that if they're a bit too Teflon tough with their teams, that their teams won't respect them or support them when they need them. So there's that fear of judgment. There's a fear of losing control and bulldozing in and getting it all wrong. There are a lot of people pleasers out there who are scared to set boundaries. They're scared to say no. I cannot count on the number, I don't have enough fingers, mediations I've done in the past where the leaders or the managers are people pleasers, and what happened in the mediation is that these two people are sitting there and they say, well, let's say their boss is called Mary. One will say, well, Mary said this, and the other one said, well, Mary says that. And they realize actually the conflict isn't between them really, it's because Mary hasn't been honest with either of them, and hasn't been able to say, you whatever the particular problem is, you didn't do that well, or you need to help so and so do that. And it is actually, up there where the problem is and not down here. So people pleasing is a big thing. A lot of particularly female leaders have imposter syndrome, so they're afraid to speak up. They don't have the confidence to speak up. You might see that in some organizations where women come back, say, from maternity leave, and they've been out of the workplace for a little while and they're finding their voice again, and things have changed in the organization. So that's one that often brings up a lot of imposter syndrome, not having the confidence to speak up and find their voice. Yeah. Whole host of
whole host. I mean, we could talk about that alone just for a whole episode, wouldn't we?
Absolutely.
And I think you're absolutely right when you said that managers when people get promoted into a management position, it is a completely different ball game, isn't it? It's a completely different job. And I've seen this. I couldn't, if I had £1 for every time I've seen this, it'd be on an island somewhere. It's such a common problem, isn't it, where we have somebody who's superb in their job, they get promoted, and they're not given the skills in order to succeed in that. Because managing people is a completely different kettle of fish, isn't it?
Yeah.
Completely different kettle of fish. So what can we do to obviously train people properly, but what can we do in terms of getting over that fear? Because it's one thing knowing what to do, but a lot of what you talked about, and certainly a lot of the examples that I've experienced, all come from fear. It's that fear of doing something wrong, or a fear of being an imposter, or a fear of not being liked. And what tools do you use in order to support people to get past the fear?
I think the first one is actually identifying it. What is it about this conversation that you find difficult? You know, what's the struggle? Is it that you're afraid of pushback? Because once you've you don't like confrontation yourself, because perhaps in your home environment, you've been brought up where confrontation is something that you avoid. It's something you've become used to. So the first thing is to actually identify what is it that is causing the anxiety or causing you to back away. And then when I work with my clients, what we actually do then is almost like a checklist. Okay, so now we've identified the fear. We work on tools to help you overcome the fear. So how do you approach the conversation? Instead of just sort of launching in, I would work with them to prepare. We all know, I have something called, little acronym I made up, a MAP of how to have a difficult conversation. So the MAP would be, the M stands for mindset. So first of all, as a coach yourself, you'll know the mindset is sort of paramount to how we approach anything. And I always say, there's a lovely, I was about to say Henry Ford quote: if you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. Mm-hmm. So if you think this conversation is going to be challenging or difficult, chances are it probably will be. However, if you shift your mindset and you think, okay, this is actually an opportunity for change or for something good to happen. So you start off with the mindset, and of course, there are loads of different mindset tools to help you prepare yourself for the conversation. I always say to people, before you start, there's I don't know if you're familiar with Amy Cuddy's work. Mm-hmm. Do you know Amy Cuddy? Yes, I do. And if your listeners are or aren't, she talks about power posing. Mm-hmm.
So I was just going to say, Nicole, we'll put a link to her TED talk. It's fantastic.
Yes, I just love, and I've read her book is great, Presence. I don't know if you've read that as well.
I don't think I have, actually. I'll put that on my list.
Really interesting book. So she talks about power posing and the confidence to almost trick your mind into thinking that you are more confident than you actually are. So there is a lot of little ways that you can trick yourself into feeling more confident, because if you show up for a conversation feeling a bit uncertain or nervous or afraid of the pushback, obviously that does show up in how you communicate. So the mindset is the first important thing. The second, the A in the MAP, stands for what do you want to achieve from the conversation. So again, a lot of people will launch into a conversation with no forethought or agenda, and they just reel off a tirade of things they want to get off their chest or say, but they actually haven't really got a focus. People always say, how do you know a conversation is successful? Well, you have to know at the start what you want to achieve. That's how you measure the success of it. And then preparing, obviously you prepare yourself, but prepare what you want to say. Again, often forgotten. People will sit down and launch into the conversation and they won't have prepared key points. Now it's really important actually, because sometimes if you're in a challenging situation, if you're not calm and you are a bit flustered, you can be derailed or the conversation can go off course. So if you do have your bullet points or whatever works for you, sometimes people save them on their phone, whatever it is, have those points prepared just so that you can be succinct and articulate yourself well. So those are a few little tips.
Yeah, I love that. I love the fact that you mentioned mindset is so important, and quite often it's forgotten, especially when if you're feeling in that resistance phase where all you're doing is pulling back, and it's important just to take a beat, isn't it? Just to prepare yourself properly
Yeah.
and think, okay, what can I do to get the best out of this conversation? And what do I need to prepare in terms of my own mindset, in terms of my own confidence, and how can I, just do that inner work, and that's not going to happen overnight.
No, it's not.
It's going to come with practice, unfortunately, and that's, I think, something that a lot of people struggle with, that you will get better over time, but in order to get better over time, you've got to practice, you've got to go through that
journey,
pain. Right, that journey.
There was a lovely quote, I think it's Tiger Woods, but I'm not sure. Anyway, if I remember, I'll let you know afterwards. But Tiger Woods said, a journalist once said to him, that was a really lucky shot you had, what you did. And he said, well, actually, yes, years of practicing has made me much luckier. Mm-hmm. So it is, and it's the memory muscle, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is exactly the same. It's exactly the same. One of my favorite quotes, and I don't know who said it, but I say it a lot, is confidence is a memory of action. And so confidence comes from the more times you do it, but unfortunately, you're going to have to do it. You're going to have to walk through that muddy
pain.
Exactly, to get through the other side. There is no quick fix here.
No.
As long as every time you do it, you're just preparing yourself a little bit more.
Yeah.
So
I was just going to say that one other little tip, which is also quite helpful, maybe goes with the mindset, is I love future visioning things. And this was something that I learned as a mediator. When you hit impasse, when you're stuck, let's look at the worst case scenario and let's look at the best case scenario. And when you are in that difficult space and you're, struggling, if you imagine that, wow, I'm going to come out the other side and that is going to be a breeze, wow, that wasn't so hard. Next time will be easier, and that's a really useful way, I think, of sort of imagining how the conversation will be next time. And each time, as you said, it gets a little bit easier.
Mm-hmm. Such a good tip, because visualization in itself is so important, and our brain doesn't know the difference, does it, between when we imagine something and when it's real life. So use that tool, sit down for a moment and just think it through. And I love, Nicole, that you mentioned think of the best case scenario, and that's often not our first go-to, is it? Especially when we're in that place of fear. It's automatic because of our negative bias. We'll think, oh, this could happen, and they're gonna get cross. They're not gonna like me anymore. They'll have a tantrum, or I'll do something wrong, and I'll get fired. We think of worst case scenarios.
Exactly.
But just to force yourself, just for a minute, and again, take a breath, force yourself to think of what would happen if it all went perfectly right. What would happen if it went great? What would that be like? So it's so important that we look at that. And on the back of that, I'd be curious as well as to what you think of call it the term difficult conversation, because something that I talk to my clients about is just take the word difficult out. Let's just call it a conversation. And I'd be really interested to see what you think about that.
I think a difficult conversation is one that there is something in there that you are anxious about, nervous about, that feels challenging. So it's either a response from the other person, the topic, there's maybe sensitivity around it. There is something in there, that difficult bit, which is triggering you, triggering a response in you. So I often say to my clients, when they are faced with a difficult conversation, you often feel physiological trigger, response.
Yes.
And what is that coming from? So the moment you think about the conversation, that is where I'm touching my chest here. That's where I always feel something. I feel constriction here, because in that moment there is something in that little scenario that you're thinking about that is uncomfortable. So for everyone, it's going to be different.
Yeah.
You know, that fear, I don't know how to manage this. I'm going to get pushback. I don't know how. This is something I'm uncomfortable about. This is something that makes me angry. This is something that confuses me and I feel overwhelmed. Everyone will have their different understanding of what difficult means.
Yeah, you're right. And you were touching your chest. I was touching my stomach. That's where I always feel it. So
yeah,
it will be somewhere, you will feel it somewhere. And often we feel things before we think them.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yes.
so we'll
Yeah.
feel it, know that we
Yeah.
don't want to do it, that we're not happy
Yeah.
about it, that something around it is uncomfortable. And then our fight or flight will kick in, won't it? We'll just run,
Exactly.
or want to just back
Yes.
away. We'll back away. And then the resistance comes in and we avoid it and we try and shove it under the carpet. So what are the consequences? Let's talk about that, because it's such a common thing that I see all the time, where people think, oh, I'll do it tomorrow. I don't have time right now. Or, you know, I'm sure it'll all work out. And they brush it under the carpet and they try and resist it and avoid it. So let's talk about what are the potential consequences of not facing up to this conversation.
Well, this may come as a surprise, or maybe not, but it doesn't ever rarely sorts itself out. And I'd say, I'm not a betting person, but 9 times out of 10, it'll escalate, it'll get worse, it'll torment you, it'll consume you, it'll get bigger and uglier. And then you'll be wishing that you did deal with it in the beginning, because it was so much, it would have been so much easier to deal with then. So it's never something I recommend.
No.
There are always, and you mentioned something just there, which is really key. People say, I don't have time for this, but actually you end up spending more time on it afterwards, pro rata, than you would have done if you dealt with it, nipped it in the bud in the beginning. So I'm a huge advocate of nipping things in the bud and dealing with it as quickly and directly as possible.
Me too. Get it sorted, done, out of the way, because you know what, sleepless nights are not good for anybody out there, and that's exactly where you're heading.
Exactly.
Feeling tormented, and it just gets bigger and bigger every day. So it's so important. Just nip it in the bud, and when you have those conversations early doors, chances are it'll be quick, done, over and done with, sorted, rather than becoming something larger than life. So we're in this, we're a manager. Let's put ourselves into a scenario. We're in a manager and we have a difficult conversation. We're a little bit nervous about it. We're following your MAP model, which is fantastic. And we've prepared ourselves and prepared what we want to say. How do we go about actually having the conversation? Is there any tools that you'd recommend in terms of how to structure that conversation, or anything that you definitely avoid? Any common mistakes that you see people falling into?
I think I would say one way I would always approach the conversation is with curiosity, because for a few reasons. One is you can get a lay of the land. So how do you think let's say it's a performance related conversation, for example, how do you think things are going? Rather than, I want to sit down and talk to you about, your missed deadlines. Because what you might find from that question is, do you know what, I've got the new baby's been keeping me up all night and I'm not sleeping, my husband's not sleeping, whatever. And suddenly you get a new story, you get a story in a picture. So how you might have approached it without asking those questions beforehand, you will actually take a different approach. Well, how can I support you? How can we manage it so that we can extend your deadlines? Now I understand. So curiosity is a really good little tool. It's also a good way to influence change. A lot of time with those difficult conversations, leaders, managers want to effect a change, and they'll come in and they'll impose new information or whatever they happen to be wanting to change. And if you invite input from people, they feel more invested in the ideas rather than this is how it's going to be, I'm not interested. So what you're doing is you're encouraging people to buy into your ideas, so they feel part of the process, and then they're almost, their foot's already in the door. You know, you can actually sort of open the door a bit wide, and they feel a bit more committed already to what you're trying to encourage them to do. And that helps with resistance and pushback to new ideas and new ways of doing things. So that's curiosity is really good for that as well. I would also encourage listening as a very important tool to use in starting a difficult conversation. Going back to the curiosity, how do you think you're doing? Listen to the answer.
Yes. Yeah.
It's all very well asking.
Mm-hmm.
You need to listen. Empathy, reframing. You know, when somebody shares something, it might be quite confrontational the way they say it, or listen to the language that they use. Reframe that in a less confrontational way. What else would I suggest? Those are probably three of the biggest things that I would focus on. They're quite key.
I love that you mentioned, well, I love that all three of those are key leadership skills anyway, aren't they? Yes. To be honest, the things that we could use on just on a day-to-day basis. But curiosity is so important. When we come from a place of being curious about where somebody's at and what their map of the world looks like, and just seeing things from their side of the fence, that side of the table, it makes things so much easier for you to have that conversation. It's no longer about you anymore. It's about them. It's about supporting them.
I mean, I'm a big one for acronyms. I've got loads of them, but one quite useful one actually for leaders is to communicate, what I call communicate with heart. So, and I'll explain. So the heart is your teams, the people you manage, they are the beating heart of the business, but it's also heart with the HEART. So when you have those difficult conversations, have it with H for humility, E for empathy, A for authenticity, R for respect, and T for transparency. So you are all of those. I think those are 5 key pillars that most really successful leaders embrace at least one of them in a difficult conversation, whether it's a compassionate conversation, a courageous conversation. Can't think of any others right now, but most difficult conversations that you will always have one of those.
Yes.
Use one of those. Yeah.
Yes. So and what would you say were the common mistakes that you see?
Depends on the type of conversation, but a lot of leaders are scared of emotion. So, for example, they might be having a conversation maybe around performance, maybe a personal conversation that's sort of going to bring up emotion for the other person, and the leader is just sort of shies away from it, doesn't know, is it a bit embarrassed, doesn't know how to manage it, blunders their way clunkily through the conversation. And then what happens is you have this kind of misalignment where there's a disconnection, where you think your boss doesn't get you, you didn't hear what I said, you haven't actually understood where I'm coming from. So it's that awkwardness around emotion that a lot of leaders struggle with.
Yeah, I think you're right. You're absolutely right. It reminded me actually of a quote that I'm so going to butcher it now, Nicole, that Oprah said, and I think it was in an article where she mentioned that she's interviewed obviously thousands and thousands of people, and at the end of every interview people tend to ask, was that okay? And she over the years she's realized that people tend to want to know, did you hear me, did you see me, and did what I was saying mean anything to you?
Okay. Yeah.
And it was something along those lines, you know. But it's so important. That's all your team member wants to be, is heard and understood. Yeah. So listening,
and acknowledged.
listening goes so far, doesn't it? Just spending that time with somebody, listening and taking stock of where they're at.
And I think relationship building is so important, and that's something that is often missed, the importance of it. Because, I mean, particularly in the last, you know, during the pandemic, you know, where everyone was on the end of a screen, you missed those sort of water cooler moments, or the, you know, in the kitchen by the coffee machine of, how was your weekend? How are you? What's going on? So that connection is vitally important. And if you have rapport and relationship, when you need to have those tough conversations or feedback conversations, actually makes it that much easier, because they know that you're coming from a place of kindness and compassion and integrity and authenticity. It's not, you know, they're not there to kind of berate you and put you down. They're there to support you. So there is a huge that's something a lot of leaders miss, is the importance of building relationships with people. Connection.
So true. So that goes such a long way. And again, it reminds me, we're going to talk about Brene Brown shortly, but it reminds me of Brene Brown and her work on vulnerability and being okay as a leader, being vulnerable and talking openly to your team. It really does matter, doesn't it?
I mean, not, you know, a lot of leaders think if you don't have an answer, that you are an incompetent leader, you're going to be judged. And so I've often had conversations with clients where I've said, you know, actually, sometimes I hope you don't have answers, because you need to learn to say, I don't know, and it's okay. And then you have the opportunity to find an answer, and of course you need to come back and share that, but it's okay to say, I don't know.
It's so important. It's so okay to say, I don't know. I say to my clients, you just, when you become a leader, you don't become an oracle. You don't know everything. You don't get some kind of download where all of a sudden you know the answers to absolutely everything, and nor should you. That's what you've got a team for.
Exactly.
It's perfectly okay to say, I don't know. I need to think about that. Give me a minute. Let me go and do some research. And that's all right. It doesn't mean anything.
Exactly.
It doesn't mean anything. I love this. So we could talk all day. This is such a valuable conversation. But I'm curious, because I ask everybody this, Nicole, what, we've alluded to it already, but what book would you recommend that's actually impacted you?
Brene Brown, Daring Greatly. I mean, when I first started on this journey, when I suppose started my mediation career, so that was, I think, 2016, 17. I was somebody who had not been in I would say loosely the corporate world, but in business, you know, yes, I worked with clients, but not in the capacity that I work now. And I was terrified. I was, you know, perfectionism, imposter syndrome, all of it rolled into one, you know, of saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing. And I remember, I think around then I stumbled across Brene Brown's TED Talk and then read her book, Daring Greatly, and showing how vulnerability is actually a strength in many ways. And, you know, that fear, overcoming that fear and working with it and being courageous is going to take you to great places. So, yeah, I love her work, and I love that book.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, we talked just briefly before we hit record that I have here, knowing you were coming on, I pulled out all the books that I have of Brene Brown, and I have, just to show everybody, Rising Strong, Dare to Lead, and Braving the Wilderness, but not Daring Greatly. So I missed a trick somewhere, so I need to go back and revisit that. So I'm really grateful that you mentioned that today. But she's absolutely fantastic, and so if you've not touched on Brene's work, go and check out the TED Talk and check out her
amazing.
So
amazing.
good.
Yeah,
So
I think
good.
I think she's done 2 TED Talks, hasn't she? And then
She
the
has,
Netflix one.
One Netflix. I love the Netflix. I think probably because it's so accessible, and whenever if I've got 5 minutes, I think, oh, I'd like to watch something just that feeds my soul. That's the one I tend to gravitate to.
No, she's brilliant. She's
good.
Brilliant. Yeah, love her.
So have you read the others then, or have you?
I've read Dare to Lead. I haven't read Braving the Wilderness. And I can't remember what was the other one.
What was the other one?
Rising
Strong.
Yeah, no, I haven't read that one.
So
I have them, not the Braving the Wilderness. I have the other as well. So it's on my shelf.
Isn't it always the way? I mean, I buy books like they're going out of fashion.
Yes,
so do I don't get round to reading them at that moment, and then I forget, and I think, oh, I found them again.
Yes, exciting.
It is exciting. But if you're a leader listening to this, then I'd also recommend Dare to Lead.
Yeah,
as well as a great
book
to go to. Nicole, it's been an absolute pleasure. This has been such a good conversation. I know it's going to benefit so many people. Where can people find you?
So I'm on, my website is np-mediation.london. I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm on Instagram, and I'm on Facebook. Shortly, she says, podcast.
Amazing.
And writing a book as well. So that fabulous. Will be, so that's in production, not in production, being written, basically.
Being written. Is that around difficult conversations?
Yes, it's called. It's going to be called And Breathe.
Oh,
and
nice.
And the theory. I remember when I was talking to the company that I'm working with on it, and they said, "Well, what do you want people to feel? When they've read your book?" And I thought that relief. When you've had that conversation. And breathe. Mm-hmm. That went well. Yeah. And even beforehand, when you're tense and you say breathe, and breathe before and breathe afterwards.
I love that. Will you come back when your book's ready?
Of course.
When it's ready, so we can delve into that. That'd be great. That'd be great.
Definitely. I'd love to. Thank you.
No problem. So I will put all of Nicole's links in the show notes. Please go follow her. She does some amazing work. Go and connect. And thank you so much for hanging out with us today. I really appreciate you.
Thank you very much. Love the conversation. Thank you for having me.